Welcome to Eternal Dread, where fear never sleeps. Tell us where you're watching from, and what time it is, because terror has no limits. If you're brave enough, share and comment, but beware, something might be watching you too. Now, turn off the lights, and let the dread begin. You're sure this thing is for me? I asked, studying the smooth red statue that had just been handed over. The young man on my doorstep narrowed his eyes and clenched his jaw, clearly irritated that I wasn't putting an end to this transaction as fast as humanly possible. My question wasn't rhetorical, however, so I met his gaze and waited for an answer. I wasn't about to be pushed around by a kid who probably still needed to borrow his older brother's ID to buy cigarettes. Eventually, the boy released a cartoonishly exaggerated sigh from his lips, conceding to human decency. He looked down at the clipboard, flicking his neck to move a tuft of auburn-colored bangs out of his eyes to better see the paperwork. "Well, is your dad?" He paused, flipping through the packet of papers, the edges becoming stained a faint yellow-orange from some unidentified flavored dust that lingered on his fingertips. I suppressed a gag and continued to smile weakly at the boy, who was appearing younger and younger by the second. "Adrian Redacted? Yes, that's my father's name, but I haven't spoken to him in nearly 20 years. He chuckled and flipped the paperwork back to the front sheet. "Well, consider this a family reunion then, lady. 'Cause you're holding him." Truthfully, I was a little flabbergasted. Adrian and I had been estranged for 2 decades. No awkward phone call at Thanksgiving, no birthday card arriving in the mail 3 weeks late. Complete and total radio silence starting the moment I left my hometown for greener pastures. He hadn't even bothered to reach out after the birth of my only son 5 years ago. I'm fairly confident he was aware of Davy's birth, too. My deadbeat sister still kept up with him, and she knew about my son. So, as I further inspected the strange effigy, I found myself asking, why weren't Dad's ashes bequeathed to Victoria instead? Sure, she only used him for his money. To my sister, Adrian was a piggy bank with a heartbeat that she shared some genetics with. But at least she actually talked to the man. The decision to have this mailed to me upon his demise was inherently perplexing. I rolled the idol in my palm, feeling the wax drag over my skin. There was a subtle heat radiating from the object, akin to the warmth of holding a lit candle. But this thing sure wasn't a candle, I reflected. It was an urn. The acne-ridden burlap sack of hormones that had been coating my property with Cheetos residue, like soot after the eruption of Pompeii, banged a pen against the clipboard. "Lady, can you and Pop catch up later? You know, when I'm not here." I wanted nothing more than to knock the teeth out of his shit-eating grin. But I could hear Davy behind me, tapping the tip of an umbrella against the screen door, giggling and trying to get my attention. As a single parent, I was his only role model. Punching the lights out of a teenager, I contemplated, probably wouldn't be a great behavior to model. With a calculated sluggishness, I picked up the pen and produced my signature on the paperwork. I took my sweet time, much to his chagrin. As soon as I dotted the last I, the kid ripped the clipboard from me and turned away, stomping off to his beat-up sedan parked on the curb. "Wash your hands, champ," I shouted after him. Once he had sped away, the car's sputtering engine finally fading into nothingness, I basked in the quiet of the early evening. Chirping insects, a whistling breeze, and little else. The perpetual lullaby of sleepy suburbia. That silence made what Davy said next exceptionally odd. "Ah, Mommy, it's too loud." "It's really too loud," he proclaimed, dropping the umbrella to the floor, pacing away from the screen door with his hands cupped over his ears. I spun around, red effigy still radiating warmth in my palm, listening intently, searching for the noise my son was complaining about. But there was nothing. The shrill chiming of our landline greeted me as I walked into the house, screen door swinging closed behind me. I suppose now is a good time to mention this all occurred in the late 90s, i.e., no cell phones. At least I didn't have the money to afford one back then. That must be the noise Davy was upset about, I thought. Logically, though, that didn't make a lick of sense. He'd never objected to the sound of the phone ringing before, not once. I slapped the red effigy onto the kitchen table, rushing to put it down so I could answer the call before it went to voicemail. "Hello? Oh, hey Alice. For a second, I was convinced you weren't going to pick up. Since you've been dodging my calls, I mean." My heart sank as Victoria's nasal-toned voice sneered through the receiver. I shut my eyes and leaned my head against the kitchen wall, lamenting the choice to answer this call. "I haven't been dodging your calls, sweetheart. Being a single mom is a bit time-consuming. and I don't really have anything new to tell you. I can't repay you overnight. A few months prior, Davy had been hospitalized with pneumonia, and I was between employment, which meant we had no insurance and were paying the medical bills out of pocket. With limited options and against my better judgment, I asked my sister for a loan. Honestly, I would have been better off indebted to the Yakuza. At least when you're unable to pay them, they'll accept a pinky finger as reimbursement, according to movie I watched at least. Okay, sweetheart, that's all well and good, but if you don't pay up soon, Child Welfare Services may get an anonymous call. A concerned citizen worried about Danny's safety in your home. I didn't bother correcting her, for obvious reasons. If she were to ever make good on that threat, Victoria not even knowing my son's name would only bolster my chances at convincing social services that she was a heartless bitch, not a concerned citizen. So instead, I pulled my head from the wall and opened my eyes, about to hang up on her. Right before I placed the phone on the receiver, however, the sight of the red effigy in my peripheral vision captured my attention. I held the phone in the air, hearing distant, static-laden hellos from Victoria as I stared at the object. Despite harboring my father's ashes inside its waxen confines, the figure sort of resembled a woman. It was hard to know for certain. Although it had the frame of a human being, the idol was mostly featureless. Sleek and burgundy, like red wine frozen into the shape of a person. No face, no hair, no clothes. That said, its wide hips and narrow shoulders gave it a feminine appearance, hands clasped together in a prayer-like gesture over its chest, almost resembling a statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Gazing at it so intensely eventually caused a massive shiver to explode down the length of my spine. Clunky but forceful, like a rock slide. In spite of that sensation, I was transfixed. I creeped over to the idol, on my tiptoes as if I didn't want it to hear me approach, phone still in hand. It was remained inexplicably hot to the touch as I picked it up. For a moment, I regretted signing for the ominous delivery. At the same time, what was I supposed to do? Reject my father's ashes? Even though we were estranged, that just felt wrong. As I better inspected the urn, though, my regret only became more intense. First off, there was no lid or cap to the damn thing. I assumed there would be a cork on the bottom or something, but that surface was just as smooth as the rest of it. So how did the ashes get inside? Not only that, but when I tilted the effigy upside down, desperately searching for where exactly my father's ashes had been inserted into the mold, an unexpected noise caused me to nearly jump out of my skin. It rattled. My father's supposedly cremated remains rattled. Rising fear resulted in me clumsily hurling the thing back down. If I'm remembering correctly, I basically lobbed it at the table like a softball pitch. Despite that, it didn't roll across the surface. It didn't break into a few pieces or tumble onto the floor. In a singular motion, it landed perfectly upright. Somehow, the base of the effigy stuck to the table, like it had been magnetized to its exterior. I slowly lifted the phone back to my ear. "You still there, Vic?" I asked, whispering. Asterisk, yeah, Jesus, I'm still here. Where'd you go? I was totally kidding before Alice, you know that. I do really need that money though, made some bad gambles recently. Cutting her off before the inevitable tangent, I whispered another question. Have you talked to Dad recently? The line went dead. I listened to the thumping of Davy moving around in his room directly above me as I waited for a reply. Eventually, she responded, her tone laced with the faintest echoes of fear. Maybe like a year ago. Nothing since then. Why? You never ask about Dad. You finally reach out to him or something? Briefly, I considered answering, explaining in no uncertain terms the uncanniness of the urn that was now haunting my kitchen table. But somehow I knew I shouldn't. To this day, I can't decipher the reasoning behind my intuition. Call it an extrasensory premonition or the gut instincts of a mother, but I held my tongue. That decision likely saved mine and my son's life. I hung up without another word. It begun to ring again immediately, but ignored it. Ignored it a second and a third time, too. I stood motionless in front of the landline, waiting for Victoria to give up. After the fifth unanswered call, the room finally went silent. Once a minute had passed without another ring, I felt confident that she was done extorting me. For the time being, at least. Shaking off my nervous energy with a few shoulder twists, I walked out of the kitchen, down the hallway until I reached the stairs, and shouted up to Davy. Honey, come down and help me with dinner. I heard my son erupt from his bedroom, slamming the door behind him, sneakers tapping against the floorboards as ran. When he came into view, grinning excitedly, I painted a very artificial smile on my face, masking my smoldering apprehension for his benefit. Before his foot even touched the first stair, however, his grin evaporated, replaced by a deep frown alongside a shimmer of profound worry behind his eyes. Once again, he cupped his hands over his ears and screamed down to me. "Mom, it's still too loud. The man is laughing and dancing so loud. Can you please tell him to stop?" The curves of my artificial smile began to falter and fade, despite my attempt to maintain the facade of normality. Other than my son's deafening words, the house was completely silent, devoid of any and all sound. And there was only one thing that was different. In another example of unexplainable intuition, I marched into the kitchen, picked up the effigy plus the certificate that it came with, and walked down into the cellar. Ignoring the eerie heat simmering in my palm, I made my way to the darkest corner of the unfinished basement and placed my father's rattling ashes behind a stack of winter coats. By the time I returned to the kitchen, Davy was already there, rummaging through the pantry. "All better, love bug?" He paused his scavenging for a second, perking his ears. "Pretty much. I can still hear him giggling, but it doesn't hurt my head. Can we have spaghetti for dinner?" That was the worst of it for a few months. Without Davy complaining about the volume of the laughing/dancing man, I forgot about the effigy. Make all the comments you want about my lack of supernatural vigilance. Call me a moron. Or brain dead. It's okay. I've called myself all those things and much, much more, 1,000 times over since these events. I was a single mom working 2 jobs, protecting and raising my kid the best I knew how. Credit where credit is due, though. I caught on before it was too late. It started with the ants. In the weeks prior to the delivery of the red effigy, our home had become overrun with tiny black invaders, and I couldn't afford to hire an exterminator. Instead, I settled for the much cheaper option, ant traps. At first, I thought I was wasting my money. They didn't seem to be making a dent in the infestation. Then, out of nowhere, the ants disappeared without a trace. Some kind of noiseless extinction event that took place without me noticing. Maybe the traps did work. Just took some time, I thought. Then one night, I was bending over at the fridge, selecting a midnight snack. As I grabbed some leftovers, the dim, phosphorescent glow coming from the appliance highlighted subtle movement by the cellar door. I stood up and squinted at the movement, but I couldn't tell what the hell it was. Honestly, it looked some invisible person was drawing a straight line in pencil between the backyard door and the entrance to the basement, obsidian graphite dragging against the tile floor. I rubbed sleep from my eyes, but the bizarre phenomena didn't change. When I flicked the kitchen light on, I better understood what was happening, but I had no clue why it was happening. A steady stream of black ants were silently making their way into the cellar. More irritated than frightened in that moment, I traced their cryptic migration down the creaky stairs, assuming they had been attracted to some food Davy absent-mindedly left in the cellar. But when I saw that the procession of living dots were heading for the area behind the winter coats, the irritation spilled from my pores with the sweat that was starting to drench my t-shirt. I hadn't thought about the red effigy in some time. As I peeked behind the stack of fleeces and windbreakers, I almost didn't recognize it. It had tripled in size. The figure wasn't praying anymore either. Now it was lying in the fetal position, knees tucked to its chest, head resting on the ground. Ants entered the wax, but they didn't come out. One by one, they gave their bodies to the red effigy. As my horror hit a fever pitch, vibrating in my chest like a suffocating hummingbird, I could have sworn the idol tilted its smooth, featureless face to glare at me. I swung around and bolted up the stairs. Didn't sleep much that night. Not a wink after what I witnessed in the cellar. I paced manic laps around the first floor of my home all through the night, desperately trying to process the encounter. As the sun rose, however, I hadn't figured much out. I wasn't convinced what I saw was real. If it was real, God forbid, I had no fucking idea what to do about it. Exhausted to where I became fearless and dumb, I plodded the stairs, snow shovel in hand, determined to throw my father's supposedly incinerated corpse into the garbage. The morning light pouring in through a dusty window near the ceiling made the process exponentially less terrifying, at least at first. When I reached the idol, I came to the gut-wrenching conclusion that I hadn't hallucinated its transformation. It was still the size of a toddler. I didn't dwell on the unexplainable. That would have paralyzed me to the point of catatonia. Instead, I focused my attention solely on getting that red curse out of my fucking house. I arced back with the shovel and slid it under the wax. Briefly, I stopped, readying myself to sprint out of the cellar at breakneck speed if the effigy came to life in response to my intrusion. It remained inanimate, and I cautiously placed my hands back on the handle, attempting to lift the wax idol. Attempting and failing to lift it. No matter how hard I tried, no matter how much energy I put into the action, it wouldn't budge. I couldn't move it an inch. Dumbfounded, I let the shovel clatter to the floor and left the cellar to get Davy ready for school. Locked the door behind me just in case. Over the next week, I enlisted 3 separate men, each of them strapping and Herculean in their own right, to help me try to move the blossoming urn. Instructed them not to touch it, another baseless intuition that turned out to be correct when it was put to the test. My ex-boyfriend couldn't lift it with the shovel, and he was able to bench press 400 pounds. My plumber, a person I'd been friendly with for years, couldn't lift it either. When he tried to push the idol as opposed to lifting it with the shovel, the grizzled man screamed bloody murder, having sustained third-degree burns on the inside of both hands from the attempt. My pastor wouldn't even go into the cellar. He gripped the golden cross around his neck as he peered into the depths, quivering and wide-eyed. Told me I needed someone to exorcise the property as he jogged out the door. I asked him if knew any such person, but he said nothing and continued on jogging. In a moment of obscene bravery, I went into the cellar by myself and retrieved the certificate that came with the idol. If strength wasn't the answer, then I needed a more cunning approach. Figured reviewing the documentation that came with it was a good place to start. There wasn't much to review, however. The certificate barely had anything on it other than my father's name. As I stared at the piece of paper, trying to will an epiphany into existence, I noticed something that caused my heart to drop into my stomach like a cannonball. Although I made it manifest, the epiphany didn't help me much in the end, unfortunately. My father's middle initial was T, but the paper listed his middle initial as L. All the men on my dad's side of my family were named Adrian, as it would happen. If the certificate was to be believed, this wasn't my father's ashes. It was my great-grandfather's ashes. The last night Davy and I stayed in that house, I jolted awake to the sound of my son shrieking from somewhere below me. Ever since I discovered the red effigy had grown, he had been sleeping in my bedroom, right next to me. My son wasn't in bed when I heard the wails, so I launched myself out of bed, sprinting toward the cellar. If I had been paying more attention, I may have noticed the light under the closed bathroom door that I passed on my way there. Seconds later, I was at the bottom of the basement stairs. I flipped the cellar light on, but the bulb must have burned out because nothing happened. In the darkness, I could faintly see Davy kneeling over the red effigy, screaming in pain. Before I could even think, I was across the room, reaching out my hand to grab my son's shoulder and pull him away from it, when I heard another noise from behind me. Instantly, I halted my forward motion, fingertips hanging inches above the shadow-cloaked figure I assumed was my son. "Mom! Mom! Who's screaming?" Davy shouted from the top of the cellar stairs. My brain struggled to process the bombardment of sensations, emotions, and conflicting pieces of information. I lingered in that position, statuesque and petrified, until an onslaught of searing agony wrenched me from my daze. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could see 2 shapes in front of me, and neither of them were Davy. There was the idol, still curled into the fetal position, and then there was the thing I was leaning over, which was just the thin silhouette of a child's head and shoulders without any other body parts, connected to the idol by a waxy thread that had been hidden from view by the pile of coats. A tendril had grown from the silhouette's head, and was now enveloping the ring and middle fingers of my outstretched hand. Never in my life have I experienced a more devastating pain. With all the force I could muster, I threw myself backward. There were the sickening snaps of tendons accompanied by the high-pitched crunching of knuckles, and then my spine hit the ground hard. Both of my fingers had been torn off, absorbed into the wax, leaving 2 bleeding stumps on my hand, fragments of bone jutting out of the ruptured flesh like marble gravestones. Adrenaline, thankfully, is an astounding painkiller. By the time I had scooped up Davy, put him in the car, and started accelerating away from that house, I didn't feel a thing anymore. While I was being treated for my injuries at the hospital, I contemplated what to do next. My fear was that this thing wanted specifically me or my son, and wouldn't settle for anyone else. So even if I moved me and Davy across the country, jumping from shelter to shelter, would that really be enough? Would we ever truly be safe? In the end, I'm sort of grateful that the idol ingested those 2 fingers. Being with Davy in the same hospital that had treated him for pneumonia reminded of my debt, and that gave an idea. If the red effigy wanted us, maybe I could offer it a close second. Once I had been stitched up, I picked up the phone and called Victoria. "Hey, I have a proposition for you. I'll give you the house as compensation for my debt, as long as you throw in a few grand on top. You can easily sell it for 20 times that, you know." Never heard from Victoria again after I traded the deed for cash. Davy and I moved across the country, starting fresh in a new city. No surprise deliveries at our new home for over 20 years either. Until now. Today is my birthday, and I received something in the mail. The return address is our old home. With trembling hands, I peeled the letter open and removed the card that was inside. Here's what the message said. "Dear Alice, I apologize about not reaching out all these years. Truthfully, I imagined you'd still be angry at me and Granddad, but I'm hoping you'll get this card and let bygones be bygones. I want you to know that Victoria was my first choice for the urn. However, at the time, she owed me a great deal of money. To avoid payment, your sister convinced me she was in prison, which made her an unsuitable choice for what I would expect are obvious reasons after what happened to your fingers. In the end, however, I suppose it all worked out as it was meant to. Please call XXXXXXXX. I look forward to 4 of us spending time together. Love, Dad." Attached, there's a Polaroid of my father and another man standing next to him. Dad looks exactly as I remember him when I left home, and that was almost half a century ago. And the other man looks a lot like him. Davy is away at college. He hasn't answered my calls for the last 2 days. Once I post this, I suppose I'll call my father. Wish me luck. I used to go to school with this kid called Jason. He was the class clown type who loved making himself the center of attention by pissing off teachers. He was always pulling some kind of dumb pranks or cracking jokes in front of the class. We all thought he was a pretty funny guy at the time. Nothing ever seemed to faze him. If throwing a water balloon at a teacher meant getting a week of detention, he'd do it without batting an eye. I thought he was a crazy idiot, but I couldn't deny finding him entertaining. Jason would eventually stop going to school. The teachers never told us what happened, whether he got expelled or simply transferred schools. He didn't reply to any of my emails either, so I was completely in the dark about where he was. Eventually, we forgot about Jason, and life resumed as if nothing. A few years later, I was a high school junior when my health teacher showed the class a bunch of PSAs. They were the typical videos about stopping bullying and being safe online. The final video we saw that day was an anti-drug one that was filmed in our town. The video opened with a shot of a large living room with a vibrant color filter over it. A happy family was having dinner together as upbeat piano music played in the background. "This is my family," the narrator said. He sounded like a teenager, but had a very deep rasp that could have belonged to an older man. "We have our fights every now and then, but they're good people. I'm thinking about telling them I want to be a pro skateboarder when I grow up." The scene switched to a skate park where a bunch of teens practiced their tricks and laughed amongst each other. "And this is where I practice all my best moves. I have this really cool skateboard my uncle gave me. It was designed by this sick graffiti artist from Seattle, and it's literally the coolest thing you'd ever see. Wish I could show it to you guys." The film changed scenes again to a dimly lit alleyway. Broken beer bottles and toppled over garbage cans littered the streets. You could practically smell the filth radiating from the screen. This is where I met my best friend. We haven't separated ever since." A man cloaked in shadows handed a small bag to a young teen boy. The white powder in the bag seemed to glow despite all the darkness surrounding it. My friend was a real cool guy at first. He always made me feel so alive, like I was untouchable, you know. Nobody could stop us. Clips of the boy doing crazy stunts like playing in traffic and dancing on rooftops appeared on screen. Everything about his bravado and demeanor felt incredibly familiar. This is where I punched my dad. We transitioned back to the living room from before, but it was in stark contrast to how it previously looked. It now has a dark and grainy filter that gave it a cold feel. Furniture was disheveled, remnants of shattered plates were scattered on the ground, and the once happy family was now intensely arguing with the boy. He screamed at his father, who had a light bruise on his face. The wife was tearfully holding him back from striking back at the son. He always had a nasty habit of telling me what to do like he owned me or something. He's such an idiot. Why can't he just be like my friend and let me do what I want? Now the boy was back in the skate park, getting into a fist fight with the other skaters. They had him outnumbered 3-1. He got sent to the ground with a bloody nose and bruised arms. This is where I lost most of my friends. They said I'd been acting different and hated the new me. I've never felt better in my life. Was I really all that different? This is where I got arrested for the first time. This is where I sold my favorite skateboard for extra cash. This is a montage of clips played in rapid succession. All of them showed the boy going through a downward spiral. His skin was emancipated and covered in warts. His tattered clothes hung loosely to his body. It was incredibly uncomfortable seeing the once innocent-looking kid turn himself into a monster. I couldn't imagine how anyone could do that to themselves. The final shot was of the boy in the bedroom, lying on the floor with cold, vacant eyes. His parents clutched his lifeless body and sobbed uncontrollably as they tried to bring him back. A couple of sniffles could be heard in the room, and I took a moment to wipe my eyes. This is where I overdosed, for the third and last time. What I saw next made me feel like I had an out-of-body experience. It was a photo collage of Jason from when he was a baby to when he became a teenager. The words, "In loving memory of Jason Hopkins," were framed in the middle. There he was, as plain as day. I never thought I'd ever see him again, especially not under these circumstances. The question of where he disappeared to was finally answered. One final part of the film played. It was a man who looked to be in his early 20s sitting in a white room and facing the camera. He had long, messy blonde hair and a couple of scars on his face. Saying he looked rough would be an understatement. It became clear he was the narrator once he began speaking. "Hi, my name's Alex, and just like Jason, I struggled with drug abuse when I was younger. I thought that drugs were my friends because they were my only comfort during a lot of dark moments in my life. They were also the ones who created a lot of those moments in the first place. I'm lucky that I stopped completely after my first overdose. I would have been 6 feet under if my brother hadn't saved me at the last second. Jason wasn't so lucky. If you take anything away from this movie, it should be that you don't have to suffer alone. There's resources available to help you break away from your addiction." I spent the rest of the day in a complete daze. I wondered for years what happened to Jason, but this was the last thing I wanted. I thought back to how he always chased after the next thrill and how he thrived off of danger. The idea of him trying drugs wasn't that shocking in retrospect. I just wish someone could have helped him turn his life around before it was too late. Everyone has their story. Your mother's memory about playing with a Ouija board when she was younger. Your father's recollection of hearing noises while camping in the woods with friends. Your siblings' tales of goblins and ghouls that you know deep down were only told to scare you. My dad had one before he passed, about a terrifying and ugly demon who lived in our family mansion for 19 years. Jacob, my older brother. But all jokes aside, I'm here to talk about mine. It was around 2015, sometime in October. That year was particularly painful for my family, as my father had finally lost his battle with cancer that spring. He entrusted his estate to me, his only daughter, as I was set to take over his position in the family company. To make a long story short though, I let my brother Jacob, his girlfriend Veronica, and dog Zeus room with me in that mansion. The last thing I wanted to do was sulk around, all alone in Dracula's castle before my own inevitable demise. Even though it was spacious and probably worth more than the planet itself, there was always something so off about it. Or rather, something so incredibly off about the surrounding town, Dark Hallow. Even the town's name feels straight out of some Stephen King novel. There our estate stood, looming over the foggy, sleepy town perched upon the mountain like a gargoyle prepared to feast on unsuspecting prey. It was particularly foggy driving up through the dense woods. Upon leaving the last few remnants of green foliage behind, the jagged curves and edges of the Kramer estate pierced through the melancholic moonlight. All was normal that night driving up to my childhood home. Esther, the maid, and her husband Josiah, our groundskeeper, were just leaving for the night. Exiting my car, the air felt as if it meandered in a silent waltz with the amorphous fog engulfing the entire town. That silence, however, it felt almost visceral, malignant, insidious. I had no real tangible reason to worry, but I couldn't help feeling as if I needed to hurry to the 2 front doors. While rummaging through my keys, I finally spotted it. Sitting atop the welcome mat laid a simple little CD. In red writing, its title practically announced, The Lamb. Curiosity took over, begging me to bring the disc inside. I ended up making the worst decision of my life. "What's that?" Veronica asked as I sauntered into the foyer. "It's The Lamb," I teased while presenting the simple disc to Veronica and Jacob. "It was in front of the door when I got home. You guys didn't see who dropped it off?" "Nah, I didn't even know someone came today." Jacob furrowed his brow while Veronica corroborated his testament. my eyes fixated on the strange item now in my possession. "Hey Jake, can you go get my laptop from the kitchen?" Veronica then sat down with me in the living room. Jacob wandered in with my laptop, and I inserted the disc with haste. To be honest, I don't fully know what I expected. Maybe some awful local artist's mixtape or something. But a video was the last thing on my mind for some reason. The laptop screen lit up with the static remnants of what was obviously once a VHS tape. The crackly screen occasionally gave way to a viewable image of a nun playing an acoustic guitar to a group of children. She kept singing the song, "Tonight You Belong to Me," a slightly creepy in retrospect oldie, almost as if she was on repeat. What kind of fuck-ass prank is this? Jacob loudly bellowed as Veronica, and I laughed at his intrusion. But just before I went to eject the CD and clear my laptop of any potential viruses, Veronica noticed something. Her face. The nun in the video began to lose something about her, almost like an essence of human seemed to disappear. The only way I could describe it nowadays is as if her face slowly started to become AI-generated, moving in unnatural and impossible ways. She no longer sang her song, but some demented version of it, like it was stuck on a short loop somewhere in the beginning and reversed. That was around the time I removed the CD and tossed it in the garbage. The next couple days were fairly normal, and Jacob left for work purposes for a week. Although I do recount the unexplained bumping and knocking at night that I could only ration away as the old mansion settling. Garbage day eventually came around, and off our trash went to the dump. That day definitely had a few more odd creaks around the mansion than normal, but nothing that rang any alarm bells. It was roughly around 2 o'clock in the morning when I felt Veronica nudge me awake. "Get up," she hurriedly whispered while tugging my arm. "Wadash." Before I could even move, she all but yanked me out of bed. "Where's the gun?" "What? What do you need the gun for?" My eyes finally adjusted to the pitch black. Her eyes stared back at me, displaying only primal fear. "There's someone in my room." I can't even begin to explain the feeling. The closest that comes to describing it is like if my heart just ceased, like there was a giant cavity where it should be. I quietly grabbed the handgun from my nightstand and wandered out into the murky void of the hallway. The moonlight was no longer melancholic as it slithered through the window panes. Its malicious tendrils created unholy shapes out of the things in the dark. We silently reached her room, and I slowly grasped for the handle. Each crashing creak of her door sent chills down and up my spine, alerting my brain of some impending doom. Her room was as silent as a crypt, but in no way did it feel as lifeless as one. Veronica flipped the light switch on, and we scoured her room for anyone who might have been there. Nothing. I heard her sigh out of relief as we left her room. But before I could even turn to face her, something clawed its way through the still air of the mansion's hallways. Creak. I hauled ass downstairs towards the noise, making my way through the twisting and oblique hallways, gun in hand. Veronica and I finally stopped in the kitchen, staring intently at the now wide-open back door. Sitting there on the kitchen island was a simple, small disc. The lamb. Veronica got on the phone with the police as I closed and locked the back door. We turned on every light in that damn mansion and watched cartoons in the downstairs living room while waiting for the cops. The officers must have arrived 20 or so minutes later. We greeted Officer Reynolds, a pale man who looked like he did bodybuilding on the side, and Officer Carmichael, a friendly woman with darker skin. Reynolds and Carmichael did their rounds around the mansion, finding nothing. I remember Officer Carmichael talking to us while Officer Reynolds seemed fixated on something out in the backyard. Officer Reynolds told the three of us that he would look outside while Carmichael continued taking our story. It must have only been about 20 seconds until all three of us jumped at the sound of Reynolds slamming the back door. He walked into view visibly shaking with his skin, even paler than before. "We need to leave," he uttered to Carmichael. And just like that, the two left. Needless to say, Veronica slept in my bed that night with Zeus. Have you ever just felt like someone's watching you even if no one's there? That's what the next day was like. Constant eyes peering from every shadow in that damned mansion. It was only made worse by Zeus' newfound interest in the vents and closets. He'd give them his little sniffspections and then just stare. Even the allure of treats couldn't break him from whatever was entrancing him. That day, I tried going about my routine as best I could. I cleaned the east wing of the mansion with jotties, cleaned the music room and locked it up, made a late breakfast, took Zeus outside, locked the music room up, watched TV, and then locked the music room up. That day was also accompanied by the occasional banging at the door, knock, 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 always in threes. always barren of a culprit. Jacob's going to be gone an extra 3 days, Veronica alerted while I closed the music room door for what seemed like the 10th time that day. You told him about last night's little spook, right? Yeah, and of course he thinks we just spooked each other being alone. She giggled, but I could still sense a feeling of terror in her eye. You're welcome to crash in my room for the time being. That house was already eerie enough as is prior to the lamb showing up. A mansion that felt as old as time itself. Its architecture twisted and turned as its cavernous hallways felt like they led to endless voids of shadow. The foyer opened like a castle into a dark unknown as the chandeliers leered overhead. Those open, cavernous rooms carried the echoes of those 3 knocks as the clock struck midnight. Veronica perked up from the ottoman she was lounging on, her nose no longer buried in the Brandon Sanderson novel she was reading. We stared at each other long enough to communicate without a single word spoken. Who the hell was at our door at this time of night? She lunged from her seat and made haste towards the nightstand, grabbing the handgun. I clutched onto the bat from my closet, and we both wandered through the jagged halls of murky black. The both of us quietly crept across the carpeted landing of the grand staircase and traversed down into the foyer. The front doors loomed before us, their haunting windows gazing upon us both like prey. But the strange part is how nothing stood outside in the misty moonlight. Nothing was at our door. I should have called the cops again as a precaution, yet I felt silly for entertaining that idea with nothing being at the mansion. Veronica huffed as the shape of her white nightgown fluttered back up the staircase. I quickly followed suit. We were back within the dim, marmalade light of my bedroom within a matter of seconds. Should we call a psychic? Veronica rubbed her hands together as worry plastered her freckled face. I meandered over to the vanity, bags staining the underside of my eyes. Don't tell Jacob. He's so gonna make fun of us. Knock, knock, knock. I felt the blood freeze under my skin. Veronica stared at me with a crazed panic seeping into her eyes. It wasn't at the front door this time. It was at my bedroom door. My fingers ached from the frost that now enveloped them. Zeus stood and stalked toward the bedroom door, the hair down his back sticking straight up like spines. I slowly stood from the vanity with the bat as Veronica readied the handgun. My trembling hands forcefully swung the door open as Veronica took aim out into the nothingness of the mansion's vast hallways. The hallways lingered with emptiness, but that presence from the night before persisted. I don't know fully what it was, but both of us had the feeling that that door needed to be shut, and we need not speak of what just happened. Something was playing with us, or was it taunting us? Either way, giving it the attention it sought would have only made it more active. We simply tried our best to sleep. Every howl of wind outside woke me. Chairs morphed into things in the dark corners of my room, and every snap of the house settling echoed like footsteps down the hallway just outside. The next morning, I met with Jotties and cleaned the west wing. I put my books back up on their shelves, replaced the tablecloth in the dining room, vacuumed the game room, and put my books back up on their shelves. Night eventually rolled around, and I said my goodbyes to Jotties and Josiah. The foyer fell silent as I glided my way up the carpet of the staircase and wandered down the twisting hallways. The shapes tuckered away within the maroon wallpaper formed dancing little spirals leading back to my nightly safe haven. Already tucked away under the sheets was Veronica, the comfort of another person being there lent to a swift whirl of sleep. Night crept on until something stirred me from my dreams. Paws hit the floor outside my bedroom and jogged to the other end of the hall. I quietly maneuvered from under the sheets and tiptoed to my door. I questioned to myself what I was doing, but the unmistakable clinks of a dog collar emanated through the hallway. My hand moved without thought, jetting my door open. I tried my best to peer down the hallway, but couldn't make anything out in the pitch black. I looked like a total cliché as I grabbed the electric lantern from atop my dresser and slowly wandered down the hallway in my blue robe. I finally managed to reach the corner of the hallway and gazed down at the end. Pawing at Veronica, and Jacob's door was Zeus. His little claws dragged on the door as if desperate to escape the darkness of the mansion's hallways. "Psst, Zeus," I loudly whispered as my voice bounced back and forth off the hallway's mahogany walls. Zeus then lunged his head back to look at me from the moonlight. Something was extremely off about that movement, almost as if Zeus didn't know his own strength, breaking his neck to look for me. His eyes shone through the piercing moonlight, just staring at me. He finally stood up and turned his body around to face me. That's when I noticed what looked like foam spewing from his mouth in the shadows. "Zeus, come here," I worriedly whispered at him. His piercing eyes then seemed distracted from my presence, slowly looking towards the deep, black hallway behind me. That's when I heard the pitter-patter of paws and clinking of a dog collar saunter up behind me as Zeus and Veronica emerged from the hallway. "What are you doing, Amy?" she asked as I froze, looking at the Zeus who now stood at my side peering down the hallway. I couldn't respond to her. I could only point at the other dog standing at the edge of the shadows across the hall. Veronica's eyes went wide as she noticed the creature within our mansion. It began to lurch forward, as if just learning how to walk. Its broken waltz faded into the shadows of the hallway where the moonlight couldn't reach. Zeus let out a deep growl as the creature merged into the murky shadows. We could only stand there as still as the dying air until a crackling made itself known. My eyes lit with a fear I've never known since as the crackling emerged from the shadows and closed in towards us. Brokenly lunging down the hallway was the twisted, unearthly silhouette of what should have been a person. Its arms extended before it with disturbing cracks as its spine and head slithered in unnatural motions. The foam spewing from where its mouth was splurged onto the ground, maggots. Its stench wafted into the air after us. Veronica hauled Zeus into her arms, and we took off down the hallway, through the foyer, out the front doors and into my car. We stayed at a friend's house in town for the night, and called a medium in the morning. The state of our mansion when we met up with the sweet old woman was disturbing. Claw marks down the hallways, paint scratched off the wooden doors, every single door busted open, and the lamb, blaring through my laptop speakers, its haunting reverse song slinking down the mansion corridors. It goes without saying what the source of the haunting was, and the medium left with the lamb, securely tucked in her bag. I don't know if she still has that cursed disc with her all these years later, or if it made its way to someone else's life, but I can only thank her for removing it from ours. I fear that if we kept it, we'd discover what the lamb was in reference to. Whoever owns that disc now, do not play it. The roadside bar was a dimly lit refuge, its neon sign sputtering like a dying heartbeat against the inky darkness. Sophie sat hunched over a chipped glass of cheap whiskey, her fingers idly tracing the rim as she tried to drown the ache of yet another failed relationship. The jukebox in the corner warbled a melancholy tune, its notes lingering like the ghosts of broken promises. The air was thick with the sour tang of stale beer, mixed with the faint, acrid scent of cigarette smoke that clung to the walls. The place was nearly empty, save for a weary trucker hunched over a mug of coffee in the far corner, and a bored bartender lazily wiping glasses with a rag that seemed to spread grime more than clean. Faded posters of long-forgotten bands adorned the walls, their edges curling and yellowed with age. A lopsided pool table sat near the back, its once vibrant green felt now torn and stained, while an ancient ceiling fan churned sluggishly overhead, barely stirring the stifling, muggy air. The bar seemed alive with a quiet, ghostly energy, as if it had absorbed the sorrows of every shattered soul who'd sought solace within its walls. The chime of the entrance bell broke the stillness as two teenagers strolled in, their laughter cutting through the heavy atmosphere like a blade. Their eyes quickly fell on Sophie, her oversized luggage beside her, and her drink clutched like a lifeline. They exchanged a look before approaching her with an air of casual confidence. "Hey there, sweetie," the taller one said, his smile just shy of charming. "What's a pretty woman like you doing here all alone? Not exactly the safest spot, you know." Sophie glanced up, her tired eyes narrowing as they settled on the grinning faces before her. She let out a resigned sigh. "Can a woman have a drink in peace without being bothered?" "Easy now," the taller one replied, raising his hands in mock surrender, though his smirk didn't falter. "Just trying to be friendly, that's all. No need to bite my head off. Besides, you already look miserable enough without my help." The taller teen chuckled, sliding onto the stool beside Sophie. His companion lingered behind, casually leaning against the bar, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. "Don't mind him," the second one said, his tone smoother, quieter. "He's got a bad habit of sticking his nose where it doesn't belong. You just look like you could use some company, that's all." Sophie took a slow sip from her whiskey, her eyes fixed on the amber liquid swirling in her glass. "Maybe I could," she admitted, her voice flat. "But I'm not in the mood for small talk." "Oh, we're not exactly small talk types," the taller one quipped, his grin spreading. "How about big talk? Got any big dreams, big regrets, big plans?" His laughter was light-hearted, but there was a sharpness to it that made Sophie's grip on her glass tighten. The bartender approached, breaking the tension as he slid another drink toward the teens. They raised their bottles in a mock toast. "To unexpected encounters," the shorter one said, winking at Sophie before taking a long swig. Sophie forced a polite smile but kept her eyes on the bar, her instincts prickling with unease. "What about you, sweetheart?" the taller one pressed. "Where are you headed with all that luggage? Running away, or running to?" His tone was teasing, but there was something in the way he watched her, like he was trying to read her mind. Sophie swirled the whiskey in her glass before finally breaking the awkward silence. "I'm heading to visit my sister," she said, her voice carrying a hint of weariness. "She lives out near Little Rock, just off the I-40. The taller teen perked up, his grin widening. "No way! We're headed in that direction, too. We could totally give you a lift." Sophie hesitated, feeling their gazes linger on her a little too long. "I don't know. I wasn't planning on hitchhiking," she said, her fingers tightening around the glass. "Come on, it'll be fun," the shorter one chimed in, his tone light but insistent. "The roads can be rough out there, and it's better than going alone, right? Plus, we've got snacks and beer." Something in their eagerness made Sophie's stomach twist, but the thought of saving time and avoiding another long night in a dingy motel was tempting. She glanced down at her oversized luggage and sighed. "Maybe," she said, reluctant. "I'll think about it." They started chatting, the taller teen doing most of the talking while his quieter friend chimed in with the occasional smirk or nod. Sophie found herself half listening, her thoughts drifting back to the reasons she was on the road in the first place. The past few months had been a whirlwind of pain, a nasty breakup that left her questioning everything, followed by her father's sudden passing, which had shattered what little stability she had left. A little fun wouldn't hurt, she thought, finishing her drink in one last, defiant gulp. The whiskey burned her throat, but it was a welcome distraction from the ache in her chest. She stood up, feeling a slight wooziness creep in, and announced, "All right, boys. I'll go with you. Just don't try anything funny." The taller teen grinned, his enthusiasm almost too eager. "You won't regret it," he said, grabbing her luggage before she could protest. His friend gave her a lopsided smile, holding the door open as they stepped into the cool night air. The van was parked under a flickering streetlight, its paint peeling and rust creeping along the edges. Sophie hesitated for a moment, the twisting feeling in her gut growing stronger as she approached. The stench hit her as soon as the door slid open, a pungent mix of stale beer, sweat, and something sour she couldn't quite place. "Hop in," the taller one said, patting the passenger seat. Sophie climbed in reluctantly, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But she silenced the voice in her head, convincing herself that she was overthinking. After all, what was the worst that could happen? The van rattled to life as the taller teen took the wheel, cranking up the volume on the radio. A cacophony of distorted rock music filled the small space, doing little to ease Sophie's growing discomfort. She clutched her bag tightly, her gaze shifting between the blur of trees passing by the window and the two boys exchanging glances. "So, what's your sister like?" the taller one asked, his tone overly casual as he swerved onto the highway. "She's, nice," Sophie replied, hesitant. "Quiet. Works as a nurse. You know, the responsible type." Her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her jacket as she tried to keep the conversation light. "Well, she's lucky to have you coming all this way," the shorter one chimed in, his smile sharp. "Family's important, you know." Sophie nodded but stayed quiet, her unease deepening with each mile. The boys' laughter grew louder, their comments more cryptic. "You must really trust us to hop in a stranger's van," the taller one said suddenly, his grin widening as he glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Not everyone would do that." Sophie forced a laugh, her pulse quickening. "Well, you seem harmless enough," she said, trying to mask the edge in her voice. The shorter teen let out a low chuckle, leaning back in his seat. "Oh, we're harmless," he said, his tone dripping with something Sophie couldn't quite place. The van jolted as it veered onto a narrow, unpaved road. Sophie's knuckles turned white as she gripped the armrest. "Why are we leaving the highway?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Shortcut," the taller one said breezily. "Relax. We'll get you there in no time." But Sophie didn't relax. The twisting feeling in her stomach was back, stronger than ever. The forest around them seemed to close in, the trees casting long, skeletal shadows that danced in the van's dim headlights. The music cut out abruptly, leaving only the sound of the tires crunching over gravel and Sophie's own uneven breathing. The van jolted as it hit a pothole, and Sophie clutched the armrest, her unease growing with every passing mile. The taller teen hummed along to the radio, his fingers drumming on the steering wheel, while the shorter one rummaged through a cooler wedged between the seats. "Thirsty?" the shorter teen asked, pulling out a can of beer and holding it out to Sophie with a grin. It's cold. Might help you relax a bit. Sophie hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to decline. But the weight of the past few months pressed down on her, and she found herself reaching for the can. "Thanks," she muttered, popping it open. The sharp hiss of carbonation filled the van. She took a sip, the bitter taste washing over her tongue. The shorter teen watched her closely, his grin never faltering. "See, we're not so bad," he said, leaning back in his seat. Sophie forced a smile, though the twisting feeling in her stomach hadn't subsided. She took another sip, then another, hoping the alcohol would dull her unease. But instead, a strange heaviness began to settle over her. Her vision blurred, and her limbs felt like lead. "Hey," she murmured, her voice slurring as she tried to sit up straighter. What's in this?" The taller teen glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his grin widening. "Just a little something to help you relax," he said, his tone dripping with mock innocence. Panic surged through Sophie, but her body refused to cooperate. The world around her tilted, the edges of her vision darkening. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the shorter teen's smirk, his eyes glinting with something far more sinister than she'd imagined. When she regained consciousness, the world swam into focus, a distorted, fragmented view of the eerie, dark forest surrounding her. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light barely piercing through the heavy clouds that loomed like a suffocating shroud. Shadows stretched and twisted, the skeletal trees appearing like ghostly sentinels against the dim glow. The rough scrape of dirt against her back sent a jolt of awareness through her, but her body refused to obey her commands. Her muscles were slack, her limbs unresponsive, as if her very essence had been drained. She tried to speak, to cry out, but her voice was trapped somewhere deep within her, reduced to little more than a ragged breath. Her kidnappers loomed above her, their faces hidden in darkness. The faint moonlight cast their outlines in sharp relief, turning them into haunting silhouettes. The taller figure held her by the arms, dragging her with an almost casual indifference, while the shorter one walked ahead, muttering under his breath. Their voices blurred, disjointed fragments of conversation that sent shivers down her spine. Sophie's pulse quickened, a silent scream echoing in her mind as panic surged through her. She fought against the fog clouding her senses, desperately willing her body to move, to resist. But the dead weight of her limbs betrayed her, leaving her helpless as the forest seemed to close in, its oppressive silence broken only by the crunch of dirt beneath her captor's boots. Sophie's dragged body came to an abrupt halt as her captors reached a clearing. Through her blurred vision, she could make out the dark silhouette of a building, a small, decrepit cabin shrouded in shadow. The structure leaned precariously to one side, its warped wooden planks riddled with cracks and gaps that allowed the moonlight to filter through in ghostly slivers. Vines coiled around the edges like skeletal fingers, gripping the walls as if trying to drag the cabin back into the earth. The taller captor adjusted his grip on her arms, nodding toward the cabin's door. "In there," he muttered, his voice low. The shorter one hesitated, glancing warily at the structure. "Do we really have to? This place gives me the creeps." "Shut it," the taller one snapped. "No one's gonna find her out here." The door creaked loudly as they pushed it open, revealing an interior that was somehow darker and more oppressive than the forest outside. Sophie was hauled inside, her head lolling to the side as her vision adjusted to the dim, musty surroundings. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, and the floorboards groaned under their weight. The faint glow of the moon seeped through the cracks in the walls, casting jagged patterns across the cabin's interior. Strange symbols were carved into the wooden beams, their edges rough and uneven, as if they'd been etched in haste. A broken table lay overturned in the corner, surrounded by debris that crunched underfoot as the captors moved. The taller man dropped Sophie unceremoniously onto the cabin floor, her body limp and unresponsive. "Watch her," he barked, already moving toward the door. "I'm grabbing the rest of the stuff from the van." The shorter man snorted, crouching down beside Sophie. His breath was hot and sour as he leaned closer, sneering. "Don't go anywhere now," with a quiet chuckle. Sophie's body remained motionless, but her mind was racing. The fog from the drug was starting to lift, a tingling sensation returning to her fingers. Panic swirled in her chest, but she forced herself to stay still, buying time. The door slammed shut as the taller man left, the sound echoing through the small, oppressive space. The shorter man stood and stretched with a groan, his movements restless. "Creepy place," he muttered to himself, glancing uneasily at the strange symbols carved into the walls. Then it happened. A low crackle outside, like dry leaves crushed beneath a deliberate footstep. The shorter man froze. His head whipped toward the boarded-up window, his eyes wide. "Hey," he called out, his voice sharper now. "That you?" Silence answered him. He swallowed hard and stepped toward the door, peering through the warped slats. "Come on, man, don't mess with me." Another sound, a rustling, closer this time, low and steady. The man's breathing quickened, his bravado slipping. "Stop playing games," he shouted, his voice rising. The forest outside seemed to press in against the cabin, the darkness growing thicker, heavier. Sophie's pulse hammered in her ears as she lay motionless on the floor, her senses sharpening. She tried to tilt her head just enough to glimpse the shorter man, who was now fumbling with the door latch. "I swear," he muttered, his voice trembling, "if you're trying to scare me." Another crunch, impossibly close this time, just outside the cabin's door. The shorter man took a cautious step back, his bravado gone. For a moment, it was silent again, eerily, impossibly silent. Then the doorknob rattled. The shorter man's hand trembled as he pulled a revolver from his waistband, the metal glinting faintly in the fractured moonlight. "Who's out there?" he barked, his voice cracking as he aimed the weapon toward the door. The forest outside fell silent, the oppressive stillness pressing against the cabin walls like a living thing. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, retreated into the darkness. The man gulped audibly, his knuckles white as he gripped the revolver. "Coward," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. He glanced back at Sophie, still sprawled on the floor, before steeling himself. "Stay put," he growled, though it was unclear whether he was speaking to her or himself. With quaking hands, he unlatched the door and stepped outside, the creak of the hinges echoing into the night. The forest swallowed him whole, his silhouette disappearing into the shadows. Sophie lay frozen, her heart pounding as she strained to hear. The minutes dragged on, each second stretching into an eternity. Then it came, a blood-curdling scream that tore through the stillness, raw and primal. It was followed by the sharp crack of gunfire, the sound reverberating through the trees. Sophie's breath hitched, her body jolting as adrenaline surged through her veins. The fog clouding her mind lifted in an instant, and she scrambled to her feet, her movements frantic and unsteady. She stumbled toward the door, slamming it shut with all her strength. The old wood groaned under the force, and she fumbled with the lock, her fingers trembling. The cabin seemed to close in around her, the air thick with the weight of impending doom. Outside, the forest was silent once more, but Sophie knew. Whatever had taken the man was still out there. And now it was coming for her. The silence outside stretched thin, every creak of the cabin walls amplified in Sophie's ears. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she pressed her back against the door, straining to hear any movement beyond it. Then came the knock, soft, measured, almost polite. Sophie froze, her heart pounding in her chest. A man's voice followed, calm and steady. "It's okay," he said, his tone gentle, almost reassuring. "You're safe now. The men are gone. I took care of them." The words hung in the air, dripping with an unnatural calm that sent shivers down Sophie's spine. She didn't answer, didn't dare move. Her fingers tightened around a splintered piece of which she'd picked up from the debris. "It's all right," the voice continued, more insistent now. The doorknob rattled violently, sending tremors through the fragile wood. "You can open the door. I'm here to help." Sophie's instincts screamed at her to stay silent, to stay hidden. She shook her head, whispering to herself, "No, no, no, no." The man's tone changed, a sharp edge creeping into his words. "Come on," he said, his voice louder, impatient. "Open the door." When she didn't respond, the door shuddered under a sudden, forceful kick. Sophie cried out, scrambling back as the door creaked on its hinges. "I said open it," the man roared, the calm facade replaced by anger. Adrenaline surged through Sophie's veins. She scrambled to her feet, her body moving on pure instinct. Grabbing the remnants of the broken bed frame, she shoved the jagged pieces against the door, wedging them between the floorboards and the handle. The door rattled again, the force behind it growing stronger, but the makeshift barricade held. Sophie backed away, her eyes darting wildly around the cabin for anything else she could use to defend herself. The pounding continued, each kick reverberating through the small space, but Sophie didn't let herself give in to the fear. Not this time. The pounding on the door grew louder, each strike sending splinters flying from the fragile wood. Sophie pressed her back against the barricade, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Sophie," the man's voice called, soft and coaxing. "I know you're in there. Open the door, and I'll keep you safe." Her name on his lips sent a chill down her spine. She shook her head, clutching the splintered piece of wood tighter. "No," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. No, no, no. As the door shuttered under another violent kick, her eyes darted around the cabin, searching for something, anything, that could help her. That's when she saw them. The carvings on the walls, faintly illuminated by the moonlight seeping through the cracks, seemed to shift and twist before her eyes. She squinted, her heart skipping a beat as the shapes came into focus. It was her. The carvings depicted her life in haunting detail, her childhood home, the faces of people she'd loved and lost, even the bar where she'd been just hours ago. Her breath hitched as she stepped closer, her trembling fingers brushing against the rough wood. The final image was of her, here in the cabin, her face frozen in terror. A scream tore from her throat as the door behind her groaned, the hinges threatening to give way. The man's voice grew sharper, more insistent. Sophie, open the door. Panic surged through her, and she spun around, her eyes locking onto the small, grimy window at the back of the cabin. Without thinking, she bolted toward it, gripping the splintered wood like a lifeline. The door cracked behind her, the sound of splintering wood echoing through the cabin. With a desperate cry, she swung the piece of wood at the window, shattering the glass in a spray of jagged shards. The cold night air rushed in, stinging her face as she hoisted herself up. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she forced herself through the narrow opening, ignoring the sharp edges that tore at her skin. As she hit the ground outside, she didn't stop to catch her breath. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs burning as she sprinted into the forest, the darkness swallowing her whole. Sophie sprinted through the dense woods, her breath ragged and her legs burning with every step. The trees loomed around her, their twisted branches clawing at her clothes as if trying to hold her back. It felt as though the forest itself was alive, its ancient roots and gnarled trunks whispering secrets to one another, relaying her every move to the stranger. The oppressive darkness pressed in on her, the faint glow of the moon barely piercing through the canopy above. Her heart leapt when she spotted the van in a small clearing ahead. Relief surged through her, but it was short-lived. As she drew closer, the scene before her froze her in her tracks. The van's tires were slashed, the rubber shredded and useless. The tall teenager lay sprawled face down in a pool of blood, his lifeless body illuminated by the pale moonlight. Sophie's stomach churned, but she forced herself to look away, her survival instincts kicking in. She turned sharply, veering off the trail and plunging deeper into the forest. Her only hope was to lose her pursuer in the labyrinth of trees. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, littered with roots and fallen branches that threatened to trip her with every step. She pushed forward, her lungs screaming for air, her mind racing with thoughts of escape. Then it happened. Her foot landed on something taut, a tripwire hidden beneath the leaves. Before she could react, the rope snapped tight around her ankle, yanking her off the ground with brutal force. A scream tore from her throat as she was hoisted upside down, the blood rushing to her head. She dangled helplessly, the rope biting into her skin as she twisted and struggled. The forest fell silent again, the only sound her ragged breathing and the creak of the rope swaying in the breeze. Panic surged through her as she clawed at the knot around her ankle, her fingers trembling. She knew she didn't have much time. The stranger was coming. Sophie dangled helplessly, the rope biting into her ankle as she twisted in the air. Her screams echoed through the forest, but the oppressive silence swallowed them whole, leaving her cries unheard. The blood rushed to her head, her vision blurring as she struggled against the knot, her fingers raw and trembling. Then he appeared. The stranger emerged from the shadows, his movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. His ragged clothes hung from his wiry frame, smeared with dark stains that glistened faintly in the moonlight. His face was a mask of twisted delight, a grotesque smile stretching across his features. In his hand, he held a long, gleaming knife, the blade catching the faint light as he turned it lazily. Sophie's breath hitched, her screams faltering as terror gripped her. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please no." The man tilted his head, his eyes glinting with a predatory gleam. "You've got such a lovely voice," he said, his tone soft, almost tender. "I've been listening to it for weeks now, watching you, waiting for the perfect moment." Her heart pounded in her chest as his words sank in. He took a step closer, the knife gliding through the air as he gestured with it. "You didn't even notice, did you? How I followed you through the city, through the woods. Always just out of sight, always in the shadows." Sophie's body trembled, her mind racing for a way out, but the rope held her fast. The stranger's smile widened as he raised the blade to his lips, his tongue flicking out to trace its edge. "And now," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "you're mine." His laughter erupted, a chilling sound that echoed through the forest, filling the air with its eerie resonance. Sophie's screams returned, raw and desperate, but the forest remained indifferent, its ancient trees standing as silent witnesses to her plight. Grim Hotel. Jill and William stepped into the dimly lit lobby of the Grim Hotel, situated in a forgotten corner of Texarkana, Texas, in 1987. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding that seemed to cling to her skin, the scent of old wood and tattered secrets permeating the space. Flickering fluorescent lights cast erratic shadows across the faded crimson wallpaper, creating an unsettling ambience that made every creak of the building sound like a whisper of warning. She approached the front desk, where a middle-aged clerk with deep-set eyes stared at her, as if he were peering into a dark abyss. "Checking in?" he murmured, a sigh escaping his tired lips. "Yes, I have a reservation, Jill and Williams," she replied. Her voice trembled ever so slightly, unease creeping in as the clerk typed her name into a dusty computer. "Room 215. Enjoy your stay," he said, his tone flat and devoid of warmth. He handed her an old-fashioned key, its weight strangely heavy in her palm, like an anchor tethering her to this unnerving place. As she made her way towards the elevator, the echo of her footsteps rang in her ears, amplifying the silence that enveloped the hotel. She paused, taking a deep breath, reminding herself that this trip was meant to provide a reprieve, a break from the chaos of her life. After losing so much in the past year, she sought solitude, a chance to gather her frayed emotions. Just as she reached the elevator doors, they creaked open, revealing a dilapidated interior. At the last moment, a man lurched out of the elevator, looking disheveled, his clothes worn and frayed. Jill glanced at him, and her stomach dropped. There was something in his eyes, an eerie vacancy that made her skin crawl. Before she could step inside, the man fumbled with something hidden beneath his coat. Jill's heart pounded in her chest, every instinct screaming at her to run. But the air froze around her as he pulled out a shotgun. Time seemed to stretch as he raised the weapon, aiming it under his chin. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound escaped. Everything was happening in slow motion, the world narrowing down to the singular moment of horror that she couldn't look away from. In the blink of an eye, he pulled the trigger. The blast ripped through the air, deafening in its intensity. Jill's mind went blank for a horrifying second, frozen in shock as blood and brain matter exploded outward, painting the walls in a grotesque mural. Jill felt the warm spray hit her face, an unexpected shower of crimson that dripped onto her clothes and splattered across her chest. Her body surged with adrenaline. She instinctively reached up to wipe the viscous liquid off her face, only to discover there was nothing but air around her. Her vision swam as she struggled to comprehend what had just transpired. And then he fell. The man's body crumpled toward her, showering her with blood as the gory fountain erupted from his severed neck. She swayed, instinctively reaching out to catch him, but horror surged through her as the warmth of his blood pooled in her mouth, the metallic tang overwhelming her senses. This is unreal. It can't be real. The man hit the ground with a sickening thud, and she staggered backward, barely able to breathe as screams erupted from somewhere deep within her. Jill fell against the wall, trembling violently as she blinked away the shock. "Help! Somebody help!" she screamed, her voice raw and frantic. People began to appear, drawn by her cries. Hotel patrons rushing from the lobby, eyes wide with confusion and panic. Jill's heart raced as the faces swam before her like ghosts, unsure, hesitant. "What happened?" a woman shouted, her hands shaking as she approached, her husband tall and protective beside her. "There was a man. He shot himself." Jill stammered, her throat tightening as her own voice sounded alien to her. She turned, desperately searching for the body, but to her horror, it had vanished. The bloodstains remained, stark reminders of the horror she had just witnessed, yet the man had simply disappeared. "There's no one here, ma'am," the clerk said, stepping forward, his expression vacillating between concern and skepticism. Jill backed away, a wave of nausea threatening to overtake her. "But I saw him," she said, gripping the edge of the desk as if the solid would anchor her to reality. "He was just here." He blew his. "Okay, just breathe," another voice interjected, softer yet firm. The young woman knelt beside her, pushing her hair from her face. "Let's get you cleaned up. You're in shock." "No, I need to find him. He was right here." Jill's voice wavered. Anxiety soared as the shadow of disbelief fell over the patrons gathering around her. The woman expanded her eyes in bewilderment, clutching her husband's arm tighter. "Let's just take her to her room," he suggested. wary but intent on protecting his wife from this agitated woman. Jill shook her head, fighting against the urge to scream again. "No, please, don't leave me here." But she was swept away as they guided her down the long corridor, her heart pounding in her chest. Each footstep echoed her rising panic, the world around her slipping into an eerie silence. They brought her to her room, the door creaking open as she stumbled inside, desperately trying to gather her wits. "Just sit down for a moment, okay?" The young woman directed her toward the bed. Jill nodded numbly, trembling as memories tormented her. She stared at the door, hoping her mind would catch up with reality, hoping it would make sense again. Soon, the woman returned, a towel in hand just as a voice echoed outside, blurred murmurs of people arriving, confusion mingling with panic. Jill struggled to wipe the blood from her face, but there was nothing on her hands. Only the remnants of the trauma, smeared across her psyche as she fought to regain composure. In the towering silence that followed, Jill felt the familiar grasp of dread settle in the pit of her stomach. It was replaced by the eerie feeling she was not alone. With the towel in her hands, she reached toward the bathroom, an unsettling intuition gnawing at her. Slowly, she pushed the door open. "Hello," she called softly, her voice trembling. Suddenly, a giggle rang out, sweet and innocent yet utterly misplaced. It chilled her to the bone. Jill steeled herself and stepped deeper into the abyss of the bathroom. "Who's there?" she called out again, dread thickening in the air. Her heart raced as she flicked on the light, only to find a little girl in a frilly dress, her back turned towards Jill. "Don't play with Daddy's gun," the girl chirped sweetly, her sing-song voice shattering the fragile veil of sanity that kept Jill anchored. Jill felt sick as the girl turned, hair cascading over her face before she skipped toward the bathtub area. Jill's breath caught in her throat. When the girl turned, she was met with a grotesque sight. A gory void where her forehead should have been, a horrifying wound that rendered her innocent words a bitter souvenir of violence. The bathroom door slammed behind her. Jill turned and pounded on the door, her small fists slamming against the wood hard enough to sting. She screamed, panic rising in her throat. "Let me out! Please, somebody let me out!" She clawed at the knob, twisting and jerking, but it wouldn't budge. Behind her, the mirror above the sink reflected her wide, terrified eyes. The dim yellow glow from the single flickering light bulb made the room feel smaller, suffocating. Then silence. The frantic beating of her heart was the only sound until click. The door unlocked. She hesitated, then turned the knob and shoved it open. The hotel room was eerily still, thick with the scent of stale cigarettes and cheap whiskey. The air felt heavy, and then, a low growl of anger. She barely had time to register the massive figure turning toward her, his broad shoulders casting a shadow over the dimly lit room. A big, burly man, face weathered and twisted in fury. "Harlan." His voice was a crack of thunder. "I told you not to touch my gun, damn it." She barely had time to back up before he charged. The first hit sent her sprawling. A second followed, her ribs exploded in pain. A third, her head snapped to the side, the room spinning. He was on her, fists hammering down, his breath hot with rage. She gasped, choking on the pain, her body folding under the assault. Then, "Harlan, don't hit her again." The voice cut through the violence like a blade. Harlan froze. His entire body stiffened, his fists clenching mid-swing. Slowly he turned, his heavy boots creaking against the old wooden floor. A young man stood in the doorway. His expression was eerily calm, his posture relaxed. Like he had been here before. "I don't know how many times I've told him not to hit you," the young man said softly, shaking his head. Harlan's body jerked unnaturally, then vanished. The room was silent again, except for her ragged breathing. She pushed herself up, dizzy, her vision swimming. The young man was still there, watching her. She blinked hard, trying to focus on him. Something about him was familiar. Her eyes dropped to his chest. A white uniform. A name tag. Williams. Her breath caught. Her father's name. Not as she knew him, but as a young man. She opened her mouth, but before she could speak, he began to fade. "No, wait," she cried, scrambling toward him. The walls around her shifted. The cheap motel furniture melted into nothing. The stained carpet rippled and disappeared beneath her hands. The cigarette smell was gone. Reality cracked. She wasn't in the grim hotel. She was in a padded room. Strong hands gripped her arms, pulling her up from the padded floor. She thrashed, but there was no fight left in her, only confusion. The men in white uniforms moved with practiced ease, slipping the straitjacket over her shoulders. She turned her head wildly, her pulse deafening in her ears. Where was he? Where was her father? Her gaze locked onto the diamond-patterned walls, the only thing steady in her spinning world. It was never the grim hotel. She had never been there. She had always been here. As the straps tightened around her, as her body slumped in silent shock, the last of her sanity unraveled.